All right. Welcome everyone to August 25th. So today we're going to talk about new features that have come out since our last new features talk. So I think our last new features talk covered everything up until the new data model. And if anyone has questions about the new data model, please let me know. I have really been pushing in all of my work to deploy the relationships model and find interesting ways to leverage that to make my workbooks more efficient. And I've learned a whole lot of things over the last year since we've talked about it before. So yeah, let me know if you're struggling with it or otherwise have questions. Moving on to today's topic though. All of the new things that Kent is going to talk to us about.
All right, so at a
That's
high
your
level,
cue. Here we are. All right, so today's host. There's a beautiful picture of Kent. There's a beautiful picture of my dog, Oliver, around Christmas time 3 years ago. The plan today is Kent is going to walk us through the new features that have come out between 2020.3 and 2021. And he's going to dive a little bit into what's in the pipes, what's currently being worked on in the beta program, and maybe even mention how you can sign up for the beta invitations. Things to think about, what I usually bring up all the time is the virtual event calendar. So of course, I love to brag about a user group that is run by a friend of Kent and I's, the user group based around sports and entertainment. It's a really interesting one. They always have really cool guests because they're really well connected in that area. I know they've hosted multiple like data teams around some popular sports teams. So that's always fun to dive into. And I believe there's user groups around other interests as well. The Tableau conference is now open for registration. So if you just go to Google, type in Tableau conference 2021, you'll end up somewhere around the page for registering for this year's event that is slated for November. I didn't read past the front page of that advertisement, so I couldn't tell you any more details other than what I know here.
It is virtual, so it is
okay. Confirmed virtual.
You don't have to book tickets. It's all virtual and it's free.
Oh, it is. So are you aware that all sessions are free or only like the primary ones?
As far as I know, it is all free.
Oh, cool. Yeah, and so of course we're always open to office hours. I did have a request this week that I am going to follow up on today if that person is on the call. Sorry, I haven't replied yet, but it will happen. So of course, if you guys need help with calculations or thinking through a deployment of a Tableau workbook or how do I do this or how do I achieve that, Kent, Kristen, or Jeremy or myself are more than happy to jump on the line and talk that through with you. And we are curious what you guys want to know about. We do not currently have locked in a plan for October for our user group in the future. But if there is a particular topic that you guys are excited about or want to learn more about, please let us know. And with that, I will hand it over to our friend Kent.
All right. So digging through our feature list. So just kind of the framework here for as fancy as I've done with this is that I have kind of a slide, talk through at a high level what our new features are, and then I'll jump into Tableau and actually show examples of these features. So the slides are a bit light to be able to spend some more time back in Tableau, and this is a subset of the full feature list. So this is me selectively going through and picking out ones that I want to call out to a general developer audience. So this isn't all of them, but the highlights I would say in 2020.3, if you're not aware of it, would be one that now we can use calculations inside of our relationships. So when you're connecting two tables, that's now an option. We now have the in operator, so we can now replace some of the ways in which we used or in the past in our operational logic. We now have set controls that can use in context filters, and the data window now has some search options that I'm really excited about that make my life a bit easier. So to show each of those now over here inside of Tableau. So our calculations in relationships would be if we go into our data window and whenever you see these curved lines, that means you're using the noodle instead of like traditional joins. And when we click on the link between two tables, in the past, you had to have these tables set up so that the exactly matched in the fields. Now we have our options in here that when I add in another one, I can select this create relationship calculation, which is the same thing that we saw with our joins in the past as our option to add in a calculation. So this could be useful, say I'm linking between two things and I have customer ID, and on one side, customer ID is just a straight number. And then on the other side, it has like ID dash, then the customer number. So I need to trim off that ID portion of those letters before I can actually line up with the table on the other side. So if we have something like that where they're close, but there's just a little bit of difference in formatting, I can use this calculation to solve for that. This also can be used in things like how we're pulling in dates. So if I need to use, say, a join logic that references like today's date, or does something like with row level security based type logic, we can add those types of things in here. So same sort of calculations, just now available in our relationship window to help us link up those tables. The next one I'll call out would be the in operator. So if you're dealing a lot with strings and doing logic to find objects, this one is much more useful there. To kind of show some examples of where we might be using that, I've put together 4 calculations that do the exact same thing, but each done in a different way to kind of walk through some different ways that we can approach solving the same problem in Tableau. And in this case, all I've done is take Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Arkansas, and I've grouped them together in an arbitrary region that I've called TOLA. So a fairly familiar approach to something like this would be a calculation like this, where I just say if state equals Oklahoma or equals this state or that state, run through all of these, then TOLA. That's how I've labeled this. And yes, you could do an else if statement for each of these individually, but I'm calling out the use of the or option here. If I were to then replace this and use the new in operator to select logic, all I have to do now is say in and then list out all of these fields with just a comma between them. And now it runs through all of these as kind of one step. So this has 2 benefits. One, it can help us with just making it easier or faster to write these calculations. So I might have this list of things that I could just paste in here and wrap within the in statement. The other piece is that it's actually now effectively running one kind of piece of logic. Whereas with all of the or statements, it's checking for each one of those individually. So as we scale up, that actually has a performance impact, that this is faster to run than a series of or statements because it's kind of fewer individual requests. So this can help with performance as well as making our lives easier from a development perspective. The other one I want to call out is the use of case statements in the same way. So a case statement is simpler than an if statement in its needs, which means it can run faster, but it's a little bit more limited in our complexity as far as we can't do a case statement around like sum of sales greater than X. So here's an example of the same logic using a case statement. So it's when, this state, then TOLA, so on, and it just cycles through each of these lines. I could then replace this using the in option here. Make that big enough you can see it, by putting that all together on kind of a single request. So it's case, state, when, and then just the include, scan through all of these 4 states at once, then label them. And this is as of 2020.3. So it is absolutely in 2021.1 and everything that is more recent now. So the include statement, if you're dealing with strings in particular, a lot of or statements that you have in a series, the in operator can make your life easier from development and also can help with performance as well. Yeah, as far as the workbook that I'm inside of right now, I'm in 2021.1 0.2 is my Tableau workbook, and then that gives me the ability to run through the features from 2020.3 through 2021.2. If you're asking about the workbook itself there in the questions. The next one I'll call out here is set controls. And so set controls are something that I haven't used as much. I should look into more. Here I've set up a quick mock-up example. And what I have here is that when I pick a given state, so here I've got Colorado selected, in my set action, it then is triggering and being used in the calculation that the color coding here and in my tooltip, it calculates for each state what % that state's sales are of the sales that occurred in the state that is selected. So then I could mouse over and see sales in California were 1,425% of what was sold in Colorado, versus say Arizona was 110% of Colorado. The idea here is I'm able to use the set action to select an individual, but in addition to something like what we'd have in a parameter selection, set actions allow for a multi-select. So if I wanted to combine Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, I could see if these combined make up, what %. So it's still California is way ahead of them, or Utah is really close to them in comparison. So actually using a set action in this way. So let's grab my state field, and I've got a state set that I can then drop in here. Expand out state. We'll just drop it on this list just so you can see that. Bump up that size so you can read this. The key piece with this is that, I'll drop it on color so we can then spot it. When I want to make this an interactive input for users, I tend to think of that as a filter. So what I was trying to do is say, drop this on filter, and then I can show that filter. When you do that, you only can see in and out. I can't pick the states I want selected to define my in and out groups, which is not what I was looking for. What I actually need to do is right click on the field, and instead of show filter, we're showing the set itself, not a filter. And that then gives me the ability to pick between these. What the actual new change that was made with this version is if I were to filter this to say be the central region, my set list here is reflecting all 50 states. So I have to scroll through the full list. It doesn't really help me in that it's showing all of these different states. So the improvement is that now if I were to add this regional filter to context, and I have to come in here and actually adjust this to say all values in context. So this option was not here before I set this field to be in context. So you have to set something in context first, then go update the set. Now, if I add this to context, I can come over here and hit all values in context. And now I have a set list that allows me to pick a state. And we see my color changing, adjust. And this then adjusts dynamically based upon the region that I have selected. So if I change that, my set list updates. So if we're using sets now, being able to control what's displayed by our filters helps make those a little bit more useful and improve some functionality there. Next one is a small one, but one that I find really helpful, especially if you're working with larger data sets where you've got a lot of fields to sort through. In the past, something we would do occasionally would be, you'd see people use C period in front of their calculations as part of their naming convention, which made them a pain to display and actually use, but it helped if you were trying to find your calculations because you could search by C period as part of the naming convention. Now there's no longer a need for that. What I can actually do is there's this little funnel that popped up here on top of our data window. And if I click on this funnel, I will see the options to filter by calculation, dimension, or measure. And actually there's a scroll in here for one that's often missed called comment. So now what I can do is either select this to filter for all of my calculations. So that's a handy way to quickly find what calculations have I added. How do I then use this? Oh, sorry, to back up on this question here from Delete. Does show set applies to sets on measures? It should, though it depends upon how you have this framed as a measure. Like if you're using a measure as an aggregate, I don't know that that would help you with a set. But it should now apply in filter and context across measures as well, would be what I would expect to leave. But I'll admit I haven't tested it yet, but that would be my expectation for that one. But to bounce back onto this filter here. So again, our options are filtering by calculation, dimension, measure, and comment. Now, if I select comment here, you'll see nothing shows up because I don't have a comment added. But if I were to go in here and arbitrarily add something in, so leave a note, I now have a comment in place. In our search options, we can use this and combine these. So I can say C:, and then type in sales, for example, to look for not only calculations, but calculations that have a particular text inside of them. So they then can search by this subset. I can do the same thing for my dimensions, that I can say look for dimensions or measures that contain this subset. If I do the F:, it then pulls up everything that has a comment inside it. Now, if I type in, I can actually then search inside of that, but it's just pulling up, hey, this field has a comment. If I mouse over it, I can then see what that comment is. So it's a way of pulling out and identifying fields that you have or have not commented, which before was something you just have to manually hover over each of them to figure out if a field did or did not have a comment inside of it. So back to the, okay, so you're talking about delete there, the top 5 or bottom 5 type sets, as those being impacted by our in context filter. From what I know, those should be impacted by the in context filter. So they still aren't fully dynamic as far as from a set standpoint, but they will at least pay attention to our in context filters. Bouncing back over to our little slide here, and I had an image of our search options. I go into 2020.4. The really big one that was added in 2020.4 was map layers. So that's the big one that was added here. And what that now allows us to do is to put multiple geographic breakouts on a single map to then build up those layers. So in the past, if you struggled with a map where you needed, say, to show city and state, all right, fine, I can do that with the dual axis, but what if I need another layer? So I want to show region, state, and city breakouts all at the same time in the same map. You were out of luck in the past. So map layers now allows us to just keep adding in additional layers on top of it. Date axis extensions is one that I would say very rarely will I expect to use this one. But it's kind of interesting that in some situations you can extend out your date axis and control how far that goes. The one that is really exciting for those of us that are calculation nerds would be the block comment. So this is one that I'm really excited about. Most people probably won't notice or be aware of, but it now allows us to comment out sections of text quickly inside of our calculations. And the last one that I hadn't seen until I was digging into this, but really will be helpful, is now we have dynamic parameter options for ranges, which we did not have previously in our parameters. So this will really help us with using parameters that are dynamically updated. So map layers, here's an example. The idea is now I have each layer gets its own separate marks card, where in the past you would have a single marks card for the map. So now I can have bubbles for a city. I've got states that are color coded here, and I have regions have a color breakout. So that's showing it kind of with multiple layers in place. So to show how that actually works, or what we have here would be if I drag state to detail, so that triggers my kind of standard filled map. I could throw sales on color. So here I have a map at the state level. If I want to add in bubbles at a city level, now what I do is click and drag city. And as I move that towards the space, I now have this new option up here called mark layers. And if I drop it on this little icon with these stacked squares, it then creates a new mark card for my city values. So I could say draw something in here for this one, bump up the size on that. And now I have that one. This I could have done previously using a dual axis. So this is a different approach, but something I could have done previously. But if I were to also want to add in something like, say, region, so I might want to put this in the background. I can pick the mark type, just say make this a map. Now I can put that one in the background, though in this case, I'd want to really wash out that transparency if I wanted to overlay these. So the idea is now we can keep layering multiple sets. So I could, for example, also have a map with 2 sets of cities. So I could have 2 of the same type of geographic field overlaid in the same map potentially. And then if we keep going with this one, we aren't necessarily tied to just maps. One I'll pull up here as an example from a blog post from one of my coworkers is you can use the same approach to do things like a sunburst chart. So now this is basically just doing a layer of donut charts. You're just doing a series of pie charts. Each one becomes a new layer. Your mark type options are not restricted on these. So with each of these, you can pick a different field type. So that sunburst chart is just layers of pie charts sized differently. So things like this in the past would have required us to do a very custom data set to do this. We could do things like this with drawing custom polygons and complex calculations. But now it's just same as building a regular pie chart. And then we're just adjusting the size, and we can keep layering those on top of each other. I'm not a huge fan of this particular chart type, but it is possible now, and it is made much more
Hey,
convenient.
Kent,
Yeah.
I have a question. Can you reorder the layers, or are they set for when? Oh, yep. Okay, great. So you can
Click and
reorder them
drag.
at any time for which one goes on top and which one goes up bottom.
Yeah. And
Cool.
if you're having trouble keeping track of them, if you click on this little arrow, you can rename them. So if it helps you to be like, well, what was I trying to do with that one? You can actually name these to call out. So I could say state 1, for example, and then go grab state again and bring that in here and do something different with it and then rename it. So I could put the same field in here, format them differently, and even name them to help me keep track of what I'm doing with each layer.
Cool. And I see when you mouse over the card too, the little icon at the top left of the marks card turns into like an eye. So if you mouse over, yeah, so you can like hide it, but it's still there. And
yeah, that is technically a feature that isn't until one of the more recent versions. So it isn't in my 2020.4
oh, okay.
slot.
Whoops, I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead.
Oh yeah, you revealed my magic reveal there. But yeah, that is in our newer versions. We then have some additional controls around how we display those that have been added in. From there, I'll jump into our date axis extensions. This is one that I don't have a whole lot of cases where I would have really needed it. The key thing is it only works in particular situations in which you have a value that is able to be continued into the future. So that would be examples would be running sums in table calculations, using predictive modeling functions. So some of the new functions that have been added around predictive modeling could use this, or if you're integrating with external services like R or Python. So those would be situations in which you have a measure that is continuing into the future and Tableau knows what to do with it. And that just lets me, in this case, add on that step out there. But to build that from scratch so you can see how that works. If I were to grab, where's ship date? There's order date. So I throw in order date, we'll say by month, and throw in sales. When I have this in place, if I go up to the date field itself up on the shelf and I right click on it, we now have this new option that was added in 2020.4 and allows me to extend the date range. And I can select 1 week, 2 week, 1, 3, 6 months, 1 year, or custom. And if I select custom, then I can type in what unit I want and the length of time. So I look at this and I say, great, let's extend this out 3 months. And I click on it and nothing happens. So the reason why nothing happens here is that Tableau is showing sales values summed by month. I can't extend it. If it had an additional 3 months of data, it would have just already shown that. So there's nothing new to show 3 months into the future. So it just doesn't show it. So it doesn't give me a way of just extending the display if there's nothing to show there. So I have to give it a scenario in which it's able to populate that. The most common way we could do that would be something like a running total, because if I just keep going, the total, it's still a valid calculation. It just doesn't go up anymore. So what that does now is just add this plateau. So I have 1, 2, 3 extra points. I'll call those out so you can see them. So I have these 3 extra dots added here for the 3 extra months that I added in, where it's just flat. So I can show it into the future a little bit. With this, it's not super useful, but it is mostly intended for where we have modeling to forecast things into the future. So not a ton of people are using this likely, but if you are trying to do things like this, this does add some functionality and allows you to show that much more easily to those future forecasts. The next one would be block comments. So I'll just open up a calculated window, bump this up a bit. Well, I didn't mean to do that, but we'll just leave that there and we'll just keep going. I'll say is we just have some gibberish here. In the past, what you would have had to have done would be for each line, do // / and comment out each line. And then to turn it off, you'd have to go back through and do that again for each one. Now this works the same as commenting in say SQL, where it's / and then asterisk to start, and then I have to do asterisk and then / again, if you can actually type, and that then shuts it down and it wraps this entire portion. So if you don't use comments inside calculations a lot currently, you might look at that and say, well, I don't see a big benefit from this. So the 2 most common ways in which I would use this is 1, leaving notes. So this is developer notes that we'll have in our calculations. So as you write increasingly complex calculations and you do all this logic in a workbook and you put it out there, you come back 8 months later and you go to make a change to it and you have no idea what you were doing. These types of comments can be really helpful for keeping track of reminding yourself of what's being done here. They can also be used to say record who made what edit at what point in time for something that's kind of being maintained long term. They're also helpful when troubleshooting. So if I have a very large complex calculation and I'm trying to debug a portion of it, what I might do is use this to disable portions of a larger calculation to kind of focus in and work on a particular piece. And then I can then re-enable that one. Or if I'm making drastic changes, but I'm not, say, entirely convinced that the new version is going to be the correct version, what I might do is comment out my current version of a calculation, write my new version of that calculation, go test it out. But if I want to roll it back, all I'd have to do is comment out my new section, turn off the comments on my old version, and then I'd re-enable that. So it's a way of if I need to maintain some history inside of a calculation that I'm developing, or add some comments, some commentary, context. This makes that type of work much easier. So please go use your comments. Future self will thank you. The next one would be dynamic parameter ranges. So here I have a parameter. Well, let's just create one from scratch just to show it. So I'll create a new one. I'll do it off of ship date since I've already got one for order date. So create parameter, and I pipe it in, and I have ship date. In the past, I could use this to kind of pipe things in from a list, and I could select to pipe in and pre-populate this list on load based on ship date. But in earlier versions, if I were to select range, I would have not been able to set the load values. So 2020.4 has added this as an option. So now what I can do is have a range of values that users can select and say when the workbook opens, check the ship date column, find the min and max values from that column, and then set this range to be lined up with that field. So if you need to have a parameter in which a user selects between either a range of numeric values, or a range of dates, we can now set it to automatically look at our data source, find the min and max values, update that range to then match that, and then we can then display that for our users. So it's just adding underneath our parameter options, underneath range, the ability to select a field that lines up with that. When selecting what field is loaded when a workbook opens, you'll notice I only see 2 fields here, but there's a whole lot more fields in my data set. It is controlled by your data type. So if I were to select an integer, for example, my load options have now changed because ship date and order date are not numeric integers, so I can't pick those. Or if I were to pick a float, I would then change it again to numeric values that have a decimal on them. So if you're trying to select a field and you're having trouble with it, back up, make sure you've got the right data type selected, and then you can go in here and then set that up. Pause. Any questions? Here I've got one from Omar. Can we set one of the fields and have the other one be auto in the range? So by the other, are you talking about the min be one value and the max be independent? Okay. At this point in time, it is a combination of both. So if you're saying I need to have the min controlled, but I need the max to grow with it, there's a way I could still solve for that, but it's not quite as clean as you might like. What I would do would be write a calculation. So I could say, for example, have order date that goes back to a 2000, for example, but I want my range to start in 2020 and go forward. What I would do would be create a calculation that references that date field and just say only display when date is greater than or has a year number greater than 2020. So it populates a column with a subset of the values in the original column. And then I would use that field to populate my min max. And I could trim either the upper or lower limit of that, but I would just write a calculation to adjust where the contents of that column are, and then populate my parameter based off of that calculation. And then I control the min and max options in that field to be different than what they are in the original source column is the approach I would use for that. So there's a workaround, but it might not have been the first one you might have liked to have for that one. Any more, I guess, questions immediately about these pieces before I keep going too much further? All right, then I'll jump back to my slides. So the next one, looking at 2021.1. So it's the newest, the first one from this year. The highlights that I would call out would be first one that's gotten a lot of attention would be quick LODs, which are interesting. I don't know that I use them a ton, but they're interesting, and I'm curious to see where Tableau goes with them. The next one would be header access improvements. So this is one that it's not dramatic, big individual changes, but it's a lot of little quality of life improvements, in particular around how we format and adjust our headers that I think are interesting. The next one would be around if you're using Tableau Prep, they have now added the option for Tableau Prep to write back directly to an Excel file. If you need to update an Excel file based upon something that's happening in your prep workflow, that's now an option. And they've updated the extension gallery. So now the extension gallery, in the past, what you'd have to do is outside of Tableau, download an extension and then make it available to Tableau. What they've currently updated to do is inside of Tableau, you can view the extension gallery, and then from there, pick the extensions that you're interested in. And they've also added in a few new extensions to be aware of. And the neighbors are getting cable installed, it appears. So my dog may or may not be barking in the background for you. On our quick LODs, so the kind of a common LOD calculation that we would create is often fixed on some metric or fixed on some dimension and then aggregate some measure. So in the past, I might have done a fixed LOD by doing something like coming in here and say fixed on, we'll say region, sum of sales. And that's my example LOD that I could sit here and write out. The alternative now way to do that, one, I could click and drag region onto sales. And that should be one way to do it, but I don't like it because it doesn't work consistently for me. Or the actual way that I could get it to work is holding control, select both of these. Once I have a dimension and a measure selected, then I can right click, and underneath create, we now have the option of LOD. When I select that, that then populates this LOD calculation for me. So one, at this point in time, it only works on a single dimension as far as I know. So if I were to select city and state and sales, it doesn't give me the option of create LOD. So it doesn't allow for nested LOD statements yet. But in its hold control, select a dimension and a measure, right click, create, and then LOD. With this, it is assuming that we want to use fixed, and it is following the default aggregation of the field, which in this case is sum. This can, I would say, help speed up the LOD process. The caveat I would have here is that LOD calculations are something in which there's a fair amount of complexity here, and we need to be careful about how we structure our LOD calculations. So I'm slightly hesitant about making something that you should be fairly deliberate about very easy to add. So I'd still say like create an LOD, take time, review it, make sure it's actually doing what you want it to do before you save this out and start using it. But it can be a quick way to kind of get that template in place that then you could adjust. So for example, I want to fix it by the combination of region and state. I can then make that addition, tweak this, and then save it out, or say what I actually want here is average in this scenario instead of sum. I can make those changes. So it's just a way of helping speed up starting an LOD calculation, but it by no means is going to solve all of the situations or types of LODs that you're likely to write. Also, it assumes fixed, which admittedly is 95% of, I'd say, our LODs, but you can still come in here and change it to be include or exclude based as the type of LOD that it is. The next one for the header updates is something that, so they've added things around formatting, the lines. The biggest one that I periodically have come across as an issue, I get frustrated by, and then I've kind of forgotten that it was an issue, is that in particular with Tableau, when you had this split horizontal, and you had headers across both the top and the bottom. In prior versions, Tableau would not allow you to select a header down here and click and drag it, which seems fairly small. But in the past, that was something that the way that you would have to reorder these would be actually you would pivot your data structure, and you could reorder it when it was this way, and then you'd have to pivot it back because you couldn't click and drag when it was in this structure in the past. So they've added that in. You can now rearrange your headers. So not something as dramatic, but occasionally was causing some frustration. They've added that in now as something that we're now able to interact with and update. And the last one here for 2021.1 is the extension gallery. So in the past, when you selected an extension, it would just make you pick from the extensions that you already had installed and configured on your machine. Now, if I select this or I click and drag this in, it'll actually prompt me with the full window, and I can actually browse the different extensions from this space, find one that I like, and download it here directly. So now we don't have to leave the platform to be able to get an extension and bring it in here. So it just makes it a bit easier to pull in extensions. And then the last, I'll jump back to my slide deck. So that was 2021.1. 2021.2 added in several more. The first one, which Sean pointed out earlier, since I'm in 2021.2 currently as my demo workbook, is map layer control. So now what we're able to do is actually turn on and off which layers are displayed, and we can make that available to the end users. So the end user who is consuming the report will have the option to decide which layers they want displayed at a point in time if they want to adjust their dashboard as far as how they see it. The next one is area spatial calculations. So the key thing with this is it's only for spatial fields. So in a traditional data set, if you're using like state, for example, that won't work. It has to be like a geographic based data set that actually has like polygons built into it and things like that. It allows us then to calculate the area of those objects. Collections or call out is an interesting one. This is Tableau server based, but all this is it now gives you the option to take, say, a given worksheet or dashboard from multiple project folders and put those together into a single folder that you can then view. In the past, what you would have had to have done would be download and republish a copy of these objects to then get them into one space. What this now allows you to do is kind of link out to see content from multiple places all in one kind of folder, which can be really helpful if you're trying to curate, like, these are particular reports that I look at frequently or that I use when I'm trying to answer this type of question. I can then consolidate those into one spot for me to consume them, but still leave them in their original source locations. Next one's here that they've made changes to ask data and explain data. So these were features that in the past were only available to those with a creator or explorer license. So the ask data option, this is natural language querying, which if you're not familiar with the term is just now that you can type in what are sales in 2020 in the East region as a sentence. And if you do that in relation to a data set, Tableau can then query that data set, convert that sentence into a query, pull in the right fields, show you the fields that it used, and return that result. So ask data can be really helpful for simple high-level questions that users have about a data set. I'll call out that the ask data to use that well, you need a data set that's fairly well structured. The names that people are going to call things is fairly well understood. And if people have complex secondary questions, they're probably going to need a dashboard to answer those. But it works well for simple, like what is sum of sales in a given point in time or in a given location, those types of things it can make fairly convenient. If you use Tableau Prep, the next one is really helpful and is bulk rename. So what this is just that if I pull in a list of fields from a database, and the database, say, for example, has a particular abbreviation structure, or it pins, say, a leading piece of text on of each of my columns. In the past, what I had to do is go through and one by one rename each of those columns to what I wanted them to be. Now what you can do is basically do a control find replace across column names to quickly rename a large number of column names along a particular, naming convention of your choice. Next one I'll call out is that this doesn't happen very often, but Tableau for the server admins has added 2 new site reports based around groups and site content. So these reports are focused around content governance. So for Tableau server admins, they've got some new admin reports that they can consume, focused around governance of both groups and site content. And the last one here is one that's fairly interesting, but it's more nuanced, is that you now have the ability, if you're on a Tableau server and you open up web edit, when you're working on that workbook, you can actually now click a button that will then open that workbook directly in your local Tableau desktop. And then you can then continue making your edits in that workbook. And then when you hit save, it will just save that workbook back up for you. From what little bit of testing I've done with this, it's redoing the familiar actions. It's not actually doing anything terribly different. So in the past, your workflow would have been go to the workbook, download the workbook, then open it up in Tableau desktop, make your changes, and then publish that workbook back to the Tableau server. When they say you no longer download the workbook, it's you no longer click on the download button, but you're still downloading the workbook. It's just putting it into a temporary folder instead of into your downloads folder. But what it does is it downloads the workbook and opens it up for you in Tableau desktop. And now after you make your changes, you would just hit the save button and it would then automatically republish it back over itself for you, rather than going through server, publish workbook, and then going through your publishing options. It's just making it so that the save option is then publishing it for you. It is not, say, for example, creating a portal into your Tableau server and you're actually like editing it directly on the Tableau server through your Tableau desktop. It's not doing that. It's just a temporary copy that when you hit save will automatically publish it out for you. But to talk through these first ones in our Tableau environment. So the map layer control, so I've got the same one we saw before. Both, so for developers, I can click on this eye here to turn those on and off. But where this becomes interesting is now if I go up here, my options, I can show this as a control. So the controls that we have available to our end users, I can now leave this open to them. And you'll see this little lock here. This is, I get to decide which of these are available to the end user. So I can say, for example, region is not an option they can turn on and off, but state and city are options that the user will have the ability to turn on and off. So now the end user would come in here, click on this, and then they just wouldn't see, region is an option they could interact with, but they could then turn on and off state or city. So if you had multiple layers in this map, I could say publish it with the city layer turned off. And then the user would have the option to say, actually, I would like to see this at city level detail. They could just turn that on in that map. So I can make that available to the end user, not have it published at an initial load. And then the user could decide if they wanted to access that information, that they could turn that on and off through this additional layer control that's been added. Last one here inside of our Tableau workspace is our area calculation. So not a whole lot to show here other than here's what it looks like to type one in. And if I click on it, the logic is just reference a polygon field. So it has to be a shape, a geographic shape object. If I were to try and do this with something like state, for example, and then you pick your units, so what units you wanted in. So MI would work for miles, for example. It's going to say this is not going to work. you have to be using a spatial field. So this new function is only relevant for those of us that are using geographic-based kind of spatial data sets. But if you are using one of those, this now gives you the option to calculate the area of a given object that you have selected. So jumping back into my PowerPoint here, another piece that I wanted to kind of break out to talk out all at once would be calling out kind of the rise of web edit features that we've seen from 2020.2 to where we're at now in 2021.2. So in 2020.3, in the web edit, so this is, if you're not familiar with it, in the Tableau server environment or Tableau Online, if you're using that, you can go to a dashboard and in your browser actually edit and make changes to that workbook rather than downloading it to then edit in Tableau Desktop. When Tableau first launched this feature in 2016, the goal was to have full parity between desktop and web edit by the end of 2017. We've still not reached it. It has been something that I have perpetually said we're 2 years out from, but I'd say that now I actually think that we mean it, and I think it could be less than 2 years at this point. But the recent changes they've added in are in 2020.3, you can now add in and create filters. So create and edit filters was not something you could do in web edit before that one. In 2020.4, you can now use prep in the browser. You can add highlight actions. You could use mark labels. You can create an extract of, say, another data source on the browser in 2020.4. You can apply filters to worksheets. You can then create sets in the browser. In 2021.1, we've added web edit to Tableau Public, the ability to format filters, parameters, and legends. So some more formatting options have been added. And then as of 2021.2, we now have the ability to format worksheet backgrounds, titles, and captions. We can create parameters and set actions, and we can create and edit top-in filters. So we still don't have full parity yet, but they're quickly moving towards that. So we're approaching a world where potentially you could be developing dashboards in your browser rather than in Tableau Desktop as we get more parity between web edit and the kind of desktop experience. I'd say also that option of being able to flip between using web edit to hitting a button and then it opens it up in Tableau Desktop for you locally that you can then save that is also working towards that. And then the very last piece I'll just call out here is 2021.3. So this is in beta. They're going to add in custom sample workbooks. So now you can update and customize these samples. And in prep, we can now sequence our prep flows. So you can have one prep flow ends and kicks off the next one. For where this, if you guys want to learn more about these features, this is the URL link, but you would just go to the Tableau feature release page and it will walk through all of the features. If you wanted to see the ones that I didn't cover, such as like a Datorama connector. The important piece for you guys would be how to talk to IT about an upgrade. The call out here is the big announcement is that Tableau is saying end of maintenance for everything prior to 2020.4 is November 11th. So if you're running a version older than 2020.4 by mid-November, the problem is that PostgreSQL, which is a key component of Tableau server that's used to store and organize our objects, Postgres is no longer supporting that version of Postgres after November 11th. So if any major security bugs or fixes or loopholes are found, Postgres is not updating that version of Postgres anymore, which means Tableau cannot then promise that those versions of Tableau are being maintained from a security standpoint. So that's the big argument for why you should upgrade to a newer version of Tableau before the end of the year. The current versions we would recommend are 2021.1.4. We're still hesitant on 21.2. And that's more just traditional, we'll say, upgrade processes of saying, wait a little bit and don't run with the absolute most recent version. So that's just saying that 21.2 is only on its kind of second patch. We like to wait till at least the third patch before we consider upgrading our production environments. So at this time, we'd recommend 2021.1.4. This one, I'd wait a little bit and then test it out, consider it. And with that, I've ran over by a couple of minutes, but I'll open it up to questions from you guys.
Kent, I have a question.
Yeah.
I know we're a little bit over, but I was fascinated. I didn't know that you could edit the workbook from the server and then save it. So you're telling me that if I take it from the server into my desktop and I just hit that little like save icon, it's gonna save, it's gonna rewrite my server version without publishing it?
Yeah, all it is just, it's still publishing it. It's just making the publish button now, or the save button actually publish it for you in that particular situation.
What if you though like wanted to save to somewhere on your local machine? Like you're like, oh, I'm gonna download this workbook, and does it have a way to differentiate?
Yeah, so that would just be instead of just hitting your save icon, you would just want to be sure to hit save as, and then you could still point it to somewhere else. So it's completely the same as far as pulling it into desktop. They've just changed now a way that you can interact with getting to your files to do edits to them.
So when I'm on the server and I have my, my little 3 dots, and normally I would hit download, I don't hit download. There's a different wording that I choose.
Yeah, so what you would first do is open up web edit, and then from web edit, then you can select that as an option.
From the web edit. Okay, I just wanted to make sure. Thank you,
So
Kent.
here I pulled up a Tableau online environment because I know it's on the most recent version of 2021.2. So if I were to select this one, go into web edit, what they have now is this new icon, and it says open and edit workbook in Tableau desktop. And when I click it, it tells me it's going to try and open Tableau for me, and I say go ahead, and this is the kind of like, please wait while we try to open up your local version of Tableau desktop. And it's downloading the workbook and opening Tableau for you and taking you to this space is what it's doing. So it's still, they say it doesn't download and that you don't have to go through the download option, but it's still downloading the workbook.
It's in temporary memory.
Yeah, so it's just a different way of downloading it. And then you're here.
Oh, very cool.
And then, so you have the full functionality of desktop here, whereas web edit at this point in time is similar, but doesn't have full parity yet.
Right.
In this space. Any other questions from you guys before we wrap up?
Hey Kent, this is Dilip here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for showing all these latest new things in Tableau. Really appreciate it. I have only one question. How many layers can be added on maps at max?
Yeah, so that is the reasonable question, is kind of like, well, where do they stop me? At this point in time, I'm not aware of a hard limit. So it's just going to get slower eventually, but there's not that I've seen an explicit limit placed on you. So even if I were to say drop region on detail, well, that's a bad one. State to detail. If I just keep dragging this one in here, I guess I can try and see if I can break it on the call. But as far as I'm aware, there is not an inherent limit built, or if it is, it's at least high enough. I don't think you probably should stop if you hit it.
While you were explaining, I Googled it and I found different answers. So I thought I can ask you.
Yeah, no problem. So at least in the version that I'm in, I've not seen that be an issue, that it stops. And at least it gives us enough that I'd say we should probably be fine within the bounds. But it isn't like you only get 3 or something instead of however many.
Thank you.
Hey Ken,
No
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you show me how you see the as data. I was trying to see on my server, but I don't see the option. Maybe the server is not upgraded to 2021, but
So
not 2 or 3.
it's been around for a few, so it launched in the 2020. So one, it is a feature that is controlled by your server admin. So the first piece is that it may be disabled on your server based upon like your server admins.
Got it.
But to show what that actually looks like, if I grab a data source here that we can navigate to, we'll go Superstore. So what it looks like here is in this Ask Data environment, which is going to load things up. And the reason why your admin might disable it is that it does kind of consume some resources. And if nobody's using it, there's a reasonable argument for turning it off. But I could ask for sales by category, for example.
That makes total sense because
And then
Yeah.
it would then run
our
through that.
server is loaded. So
Oh, they've added lenses now is how so they've changed their approach to this. Interesting. So I say that and they've then changed how you interact with it. So used to you went straight into this space and you could ask a question. Now you have to create a lens. They've added a layer that you could then save this. I could say
what does
save.
lens means? I'm not sure.
What it is it's just saving a view. So it's a way to save your query effectively. So if you got to a result that you liked that you wanted to keep,
Okay.
the lens is a framework to save that information.
Got it.
And you'll see as I type it pulls in like here's the fields I'm selecting. I'm using sum of sales by category. And then when I hit enter, Tableau takes that information and then generates this bar chart for me, for example. So it's just a way of converting a question into a visual without necessarily me having to know how to build that or having access to build that.
So you just can ask questions or do the ask data on the published data sources, or
Yes.
can you do it on your
So it's
dashboards too?
published data sources on the Tableau server is where we could use this. I'd say it has a space in scenarios in which you have a variety of people that need to ask very simple high-level questions.
Mhm.
That gives them a way to do that. The problem I find with it is that the first question leads to the second question. And the second and third question they ask are where they start to get to be more complex than fits well within the space. And then you need a dashboard. So as soon as you start asking, well, but sales within technology, but split by month inside of this and this and this, like as you get more complex, then you need a dashboard again. So it's just keeping it to really high level questions. I think it works well. But if people have those second and third level questions, you're probably going to need a dashboard at that point.
I guess you're right, because Tableau isn't providing that kind of facility to the naive people.
Yeah, and so I live in desktop and I'm very comfortable building content. So I just want to go straight to the content and creation stuff over using Ask Data. But I think we'll see it grow over time, but I'd still only recommend it for scenarios in which you have fairly high level simplistic questions that people need to ask. Like, what are sales today? Give me a place to go ask that question and say sales in my region today. Like, cool.
Maybe
I can answer that.
Maybe it's more appropriate for the people who are like directors or regional presidents. If they want to get today
Yeah.
or month and whatever they want to do it, maybe it's for them.
It's definitely geared towards that group.
Yep.
I'd say it's that or very frontline individuals. So somebody who's like, say, a store manager and they want to query the data set to say like, how much of X did I sell today? Like that type of question. That you have a couple of simple filters, but you don't need complex analysis. It's just slice and dice to give a number. You could still build a report to do that. And I'd want to build a report to do that, but it gives you a path to that. So it's an option.
Thank you so much, Ken. Appreciate it.
No problem. All right. Anything else before we wrap up? We'll say this was our meet and greet portion that we had scheduled, right? All right. If not, I'll go ahead and wrap up. And the big call out here is that we're still pinning down our content for October. So if anyone has any content they would be willing to share or present, that would be amazing. If you have particular content topics that you're interested in, please reach out and let us know. And with that, I'll stop my screen share and we'll call it a day. So I'll talk to you guys later.
Thanks, Kent.